Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, why the Dalai Lama wasn't fussed about not meeting Julia Gillard. Have Labor and the Coalition swapped roles on asylum seekers? And we talk to Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison about his trip to Nauru. Our panel tonight, ABC Online's Chief Political Writer, Annabel Crabb, CEO of Rate City, Damian Smith, and Jessica Brown from the Centre for Independent Studies. Well, as federal MPs returned to Canberra, the issue of asylum seekers once again dominated question time. And at times, it seemed like Labor and the Coalition had traded places, with Julia Gillard talking about getting tough on people smugglers and Tony Abbott accusing the government of inhumane treatment.
Will the Prime Minister pick up the phone to the President of Nauru to reopen a centre which is humane, cost-effective and proven in the fight to stop people smuggling?
Under the Leader of the Opposition's plan, which is a fundamentally weaker plan, what would happen is people smugglers would be able to say to asylum seekers, sure, you'll have to go to Nauru, but you will end up in Australia.
How can you sit there? How can members of the left sit there silent when this government is proposing to deal with boat people in a way which is infinitely worse, vastly worse? Tom Uren has been sitting in this parliament today, listening to members of the Labor Party support a solution for the people smuggling problem which exposes people who come to this country to caning with the rattan.
Even on the question of Nauru, did we actually see any costings come out from them on Nauru? Did we see any solutions? It is the longest distance that anyone has ever travelled to do a doorstop.
Annabel, didn't seem quite right in question time today, did it? The rhetoric.
That's just, I don't know, you see a lot of funny things. It's a weird old day, I think, where you see Tony Abbott appealing to the heavens to Tom Uren to take up his cause. I mean, you get the sense that Tony Abbott is kind of terribly upset that the left of the Labor Party isn't more upset about the Malaysian solution. And look, this is a long argument and a complicated one that involves all sorts of rethinks on all sides. But on the other hand, to hear the Prime Minister carry on about the problem with Nauru being that it's too much of a soft option is kind of a little bit of a change too, not necessarily for Julia Gillard personally, whose approach to border protection and asylum seeker policy has been fairly consistent over the last 10 years, but certainly for some of her colleagues that's a pretty unusual thing to hear.
Damian, how would the people in the Labor Party left feel about Tony Abbott invoking the name of Tom Uren, the lion of the left in the ALP for so many years?
Look, I think it's fair to say that the only thing Tom Uren and Tony Abbott have in common is they both got a hell of a jab. These are both great former boxers. I think this is actually a reflection of what happens in a 51-49 world. I think that, Annabel wrote an article about it the other week. See, people do read your articles, Annabel, about, basically all policies being completely interchangeable depending solely on which side of the chamber they're sitting on. I think we can guarantee that if suddenly the independents change sides, then a range of those rhetorical views on both sides would change. And, I think it's one of the more disturbing things about the 51-49 environment we're in right now is that we've got a set of views that, frankly, are not terribly deeply held on either side and really will change depending on people's reading of what's most likely to win that day.
Jess, interesting that Julia Gillard today was arguing that Nauru is a weak policy in question time. That's very different to what she was saying in opposition.
Yeah, it's sort of like opposites day, or when you wake up after a long time away and think, hang on, what's going on here? But, I think you can understand why people feel a bit disaffected with politics when, as you said, no one actually has a conviction. Everyone changes at the drop of a hat, and both major parties are singing from the same song sheet depending on what day it is. It's little wonder that people say, why bother following this? I'm not interested.
Well, it's barely a week since live cattle exports to Indonesia were suspended, but already the opposition is calling for the trade to resume soon. Tony Abbott was pushing for a speedy resolution during question time.
Do remind the Prime Minister that there are at least some abattoirs in Indonesia which already clearly meet Australian animal welfare standards, and I ask the Prime Minister, why can't the live export trade to those abattoirs be resumed immediately?
But the Prime Minister stressed that won't happen until the ethical treatment of Australian cattle can be guaranteed.
So unless we are able to track and ensure that if we say conditions are appropriate in one facility, that Australian cattle are going to that facility and that facility alone and not ending up in other facilities, then clearly we haven't solved the problem.
And today the Labor caucus voted to continue its support for the ban until Indonesian abattoirs meet international standards. Jess, the Liberal Party's arguing that they should open those 4 to 6 abattoirs to the live export trade. What do you think?
Yeah, I actually agree with them because I wonder what is a total ban really going to help us achieve these animal welfare objectives? If it goes on for much longer, Indonesia's going to start sourcing beef from other places. The reaction within Indonesia immediately has been to talk about moving towards self-sufficiency in beef. So I wonder, by completely pulling out or by putting a stop to the trade, are we really achieving those animal welfare objectives that we're setting out to achieve? I think a better way to do it may be to resume trade with these 10 abattoirs and then come up with a way to work with the other abattoirs to get them up to standard.
Annabel, the WA Liberal Senator Chris Back had some interesting things to say within the Liberal Party room today. He's a former cattle vet.
That's right. And look, he apparently made about a 20-minute contribution, which, I mean, in the history of long contributions on the Coalition Party room floor, and there are quite a few, that's a pretty good effort. Anyway, he had this kind of doomsday scenario mapped out. He said, and I don't quite understand the nuances of this, but he said he told the party room that if the situation went on for another month, that 150,000 head of cattle there in the north would be too heavy to be shipped north and yet too light to be shipped south. I'm not quite sure how that adds up. But
his argument seemed to be that they'd have to be either shot or let loose on the rangelands.
To roam the landscape. And he said, look, taking Jess's point about where else the Indonesians might source their beef, he said that if the Indonesians are forced to source their beef from India, then you're looking at a serious foot and mouth infection problem, which could transfer to Australia with, I mean, the whole scenario ended up with waterholes being poisoned throughout the top end. So, you know, I think it's fair to say that this is an issue that is kind of transfixing both the Coalition Party room and the caucus, which had a lengthy discussion about